Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we are going to hear about the book Vortex, The Crisis of Patriarchy by Susan Hawthorne, and it's going to be discussed by Caroline, Norma and Susan Hawthorne. So thank you very much, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Jo. And yes, as Jo just kindly mentioned, I'm here, Caroline, with Susan Hawthorne to speak about her 2020 published book through Spinifex called, as Jo mentioned, Vortex, The Crisis of Patriarchy. So obviously we're going to hear from Susan most of all, but just for my little bit, I'll start by introducing the chapters of the book, which are 9 in total, and then me and Susan will address a few different chapters each. So I'll mention those chapter titles to start us off with. Before then, I thought I'd just give a read out a paragraph from chapter 2 of Susan's book, Vortex, because I think this paragraph from chapter 2 just happens to encapsulate the structure of the book as a whole. So I'll read the little synopsis of the book as a whole, and then I'll give you the chapter titles. And hopefully as I do so, you'll be able to, the structure of the book overall will start to become a little bit clearer to start us off with. So Susan writes in chapter 2 that in this book, you will read of the many different ways in which disconnection and separation from self are pursued by large corporates and by billionaires who are changing cultural narratives and affecting the ways in which we see ourselves. It stretches from micro-colonialism to colonialism and de-territoriality on a massive scale. It includes many varieties of ways in which women are colonized, from testing for Down syndrome to being convinced their bodies are not good enough, from a sense of homelessness in the body that pervades women who have been prostituted, to refugees incarcerated for escaping violence in their countries, to being made homeless and landless in one's own country, or seeing the destruction of land, water, and air on which we all depend. So that's just the little structure that I hope, or the paragraph that I hope gives an indication of the structure. And then the chapter titles are, and we'll go back to these as we talk about each one, but the first chapter is called The Crisis of Economics, Patriarchal Wars Against People and the Planet. Chapter 2 is Less Than Perfect, Medical Wars Against People with Disabilities. Chapter 3, Feminist Cassandras, Men's Patriotic Wars Against Women's Intimate Lives. And here Cassandras means a prophet of disaster, especially one who is disregarded. And those of you who know your Greek mythology will know that, as I didn't. And then going to chapter 4, the title of chapter 4 is Biocolonialism and Bioprospecting, Wars Against Indigenous Peoples and Women. Chapter 5, De-territoriality and Breaking the Spirit, Land, Refugees and Trauma. Chapter 6, Colonization, Erasure and Torture, Wars Against Lesbians. Chapter 7, Breaking the Spirit of the Women's Liberation Movement, the War Against Biology, which some of you will anticipate the content of. And then chapter 8, Breaking the Spirit of the Planet, Climate Catastrophe. And then chapter 9 is the concluding chapter to Vortex, written by Susan Hawthorne, published in 2020, and that title is Sovereignty and the Spirit of Nature. Okay, so that's just to give you an idea of the structure as we go along for each chapter. But before we do, I'll throw now to Susan. I'm sure everyone is waiting to hear from Susan Hawthorne. And I'd just like to ask Susan if you had any ideas about why did you write the book at the particular time, 2020, when it was published? Why did you start, what provoked you to embark upon the book's writing? Why did you give it the title Vortex, out of interest?
I started writing it after 2 publishers on different continents asked me to write a shorter version of Wild Politics, Feminism, Globalization and Biodiversity, which I'd published back in 2002. And these 2 publishers approached me in 2017. And so I started in 2018, but it was simply not possible to repeat myself after almost 20 years had elapsed, because so much had changed. and so it turned into the book that they didn't want me to write. And indeed, one of them, the timing was bad, and for the other one, chapter 7 was bad. So what I did write, though, was a lot of things I wished I'd included in Wild Politics. Mostly that's about bodies. I really, that struck me after I finished Wild Politics, that I had missed something there. And as for the title, I woke up one morning with the word vortex in my head. And I wasn't entirely sure what it meant, so I looked it up. I mean, I knew that it was a bad thing, and that a vortex might be quite hard to get out of. And in fact, a downward spiral is impossible to get out of. And it seemed to me that this was the moment to talk about the crisis of patriarchy. And it's also just that, you know, this vortex thing is, I love spirals, but this sense of going down, down, down was something I wanted to explore more. The other thing that I did in the writing of the book was to open every chapter with a quote, sometimes an extract from a poem or a piece of fiction by me and by others. Because there are many ways of saying the same things, and sometimes those things hit harder and strike you in a different way than a whole lot of non-fiction-y and analysis. And I've also included charts, and they were part of the process of writing the book as I figured out what was going on, what the similarities were, how the ways in which things operated and that sort of stuff. So that's the reason for the charts, and I mentioned them on a couple of occasions while I'm talking, and I'll show you one picture when I get to chapter 5 of a chart.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. Those tables are particularly helpful as we read the book. So yeah, listeners will see one come up in a minute. Thanks, Susan. So that understanding of having chosen vortex as the metaphor that kind of organises the book's message is really interesting when it comes to the first chapter. So the first chapter, The Crisis of Economics, Patriarchal Wars Against People on the Planet, as I said. It's really useful, I think, because precisely Susan Hawthorne in this chapter describes globalisation in terms of the trap that it sets for particularly women at a global scale. So Susan Hawthorne calls it the system of globalisation as a speeding vortex, where every failure is a new business opportunity. In other words, an element of the neoliberal capitalist push into every corner of the world is the view that, as Susan says, every failure is a new business opportunity, and this is called the speeding vortex, which I thought was really nicely described. And it's interesting that Susan's metaphor for the book contrasts with Mary Daly's sort of spinning type, positively posed kind of metaphor for women's futures, whereas I think in this book we get the flip side of that coin of Mary Daly's spinning and weaving, and instead we get this vortex spiraling down. So in the book, in the first chapter, it's globalization is the focus, and I'll ask Susan a question at the end about this chapter and one of its main points. But first of all, to say that, so Susan defines globalization a bit differently to what you'd usually find in the typical critical theory, social theory books by the male left. She defines, I think, globalization more holistically as a universalized system of monetary and cultural trade that benefits the rich, mobile and male sectors of the world, including the transnational sector. It is built upon Western knowledge and property systems and assumes that these are regarded universally as good regimes. So that's the unique definition of globalization that structures chapter 1. And then Susan explores the metaphor of the vortex as it plays out in terms of political economy. And so she says that the poor are told that they will have access to more goods, but these are created as fake wants and needs. So on the one hand, women particularly are set up as consumers in the male globalized world, but consumers of not things that are actually meeting the needs of themselves and their children, but actually, yeah, as Susan says, fake wants and needs. And on the other hand, as Susan writes, neoliberalism marks every person as a consumer, and secondly, as an individual out of whom productivity should be squeezed. And as a result, what we had in the past, quote, while colonization separated the state from sovereignty, it created an immaterial territoriality connected to dependence on a colonial power. So we're talking about the 19th century colonialism system, but of course globalization came in and it was very different. But under globalization, quote, the dependence has shifted to a deterritorialized corporate power. And so in resistance to this, opposition to this system that we now have, Susan explores the universal basic income proposals. Susan presents arguments both for and against universal basic income, but I just wanted to ask further, Susan, whether you had any further enlightened things you could share with us about universal basic income, because obviously this is a fairly discussed topic even amongst feminists.
I'll talk about it as the UBI, Universal Basic Income. When I first heard about the UBI, I was really, really excited. I thought, what a fabulous idea. And my main reason for seeing the plus side is women's poverty, and also the poverty of different groups of people all around the world. But having seen other do-gooding proposals like the Hague Mothers, for example, that backfire on women, I really worry that this will happen here as well, as it has in Bangladesh with microcredit as well. The UBI is a basic income which is available to everyone. Nobody is exempt. Part of the argument for it is that it would be cheaper than all the systems that are currently in place to stop those on welfare, and I say, and those who are not, to rot the system. But UBI alone won't fix the problem. Taxing transnational companies via a Tobin tax, for example, which is a tax on international financial transactions, which it's a very, very small percent. It's like 0.01%, and you and I wouldn't notice it. A, we don't do a lot of that, and B, it's a minuscule amount. But if you're a billionaire, then you do feel it. But we'd also need to have that instituted along with universal healthcare, free education, and other measures to get billionaires and corporates to contribute to the common good. So yes, I'm in favour of it, but not just that. It's not going to fix it alone.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I have heard, sisters in Canada talk about it too, and yeah, I mean, and even Carol Pateman supports it. Yeah, I must admit, I don't know on what basis feminists can possibly support UBI, but yeah, obviously, it just seems a little bit. In Australia, we've had the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is again one of those neoliberal fixes to, which should be sort of state welfare, but yeah, seems to be.
It should be really good, but
away.
more and more people have come onto the NDIS, including people who probably don't need it.
Right. Thanks, Susan. That was really interesting. I'll now pass to you, Susan, to describe chapter 2, or to comments upon it, Less Than Perfect Medical Wars Against People with Disabilities.
Vortex is a very personal book. It includes stuff on disability, prostitution, trauma, torture, and transgenderism. But after my chapter on economics, which was central to my analysis in Wild Politics, I begin with disability. As a child growing up, I knew I was different, and this difference turned out to be epilepsy. And while I got through my childhood without any grand mal seizures, it soon caught up with me in my early 20s, probably exacerbated by taking the pill during my heterosexual phase. My life has been significantly affected by epilepsy, and it is possible to lose entire days. Indeed, on 2 occasions, I've lost 3 days, once in my 20s and once again recently. Epilepsy is mostly a hidden disability until it isn't. When it becomes very public, when grand mal seizures happen in offices, streets, milk bars, writers' festivals. There is no hiding it when that occurs. My mother was very secretive about it, and from the age of 14 to 23, I kept a very tight hold on this secret. The very first time I wrote about it was in a consciousness raising group. I shook, my voice shook. I expected the women in the group to leave and never speak to me again. Instead, they shrugged their shoulders and thought it wasn't really all that bad. So beginning Vortex with a chapter called Less Than Perfect Medical Wars Against People with Disabilities is a political statement, because disability is so frequently at the end of lists of political categories, along with lesbians and ageism. But it was the politics of disability that initially politicized me as a radical feminist. And in this chapter, I write about how feminism also allowed me to understand how disability was framed as an oppressed category. The ruling classes for people with a disability are those who don't have a disability. And because of this, there's a significant amount of infantilization of anyone with a disability. But radical feminists have been writing about this oppressive disdaining since the 1980s. Colonization is a key strategy for the powerful. And in this time of growth, the growth of the industrial medical system, thanks to Jennifer Billett for that phrase, people with a disability are being eugenically erased through fear-mongering and prenatal diagnosis. Likewise, terms like harm minimisation are dragged out whenever politicians and social commentators have to talk about a subject they consider grubby in some way. Having a grand mal seizure in public is considered antisocial. There is also a tendency to ignore sexuality, as if all disabled people are heterosexual. This in turn leads to normalisation and erasure. And if the tech docs get their way, the replacement of people in the disability category with designer babies. But there are many acquired disabilities that come from living, so perfection is unattainable. What will we lose if we eliminate people with disabilities? Rebecca Maxwell, a friend of mine who lost her sight at a very young age, talks about perceiving the world and experiencing it in different ways. I know from my own experiences that I've learned things about consciousness and about myself and others. I would not give that up tomorrow if some biotech doc were to make promises, if only I would use his new smart technology. So you also asked me at that point, Carolyn, what reactions I'd had to the book since it's been released. Well, I think it's really interesting. Among radical feminists, I've had really positive reactions, but there hasn't been a single peep out of the mainstream. In fact, I think, I don't think it's ever been reviewed anywhere in a place that you would consider not a radical feminist place. Yeah, so that's what I expected.
Yes. Meanwhile, we have, I think Wolfgang Streck's latest book probably got reviewed everywhere. David Harvey gets 6 figures for his books.
And so you're now going to talk about feminist Sandra's men's patriotic wars against women's intimate lives.
I am, because this was probably my favourite chapter. I have some interest in military and civilian forms of prostitution as being very similar. This chapter was fascinating. Susan theorises men's conflict as patriotic wars that are carried out against women, but for the purposes of men. So to solidify men's relations, or to punish other men, or to protect men's nations or resources, or some interest, which is I thought was a really interesting and good framing of what we face under patriarchy in terms of wars. Susan writes at the outset that, quote, It is at the intersection of common property as held by men and autonomy or independence as held by women that the danger of violence to women erupts. It occurs when the property of one man is trespassed upon by another. It occurs in war when the property of the enemy changes hands and is taken over by the victors. These men state their claim as if staking a claim to common land or enemy land, take the women by force if they deem necessary. These acts of violence are often not perceived as violence by men, but as their right, and appeal to the male sex right. So the male sex right is discussed in this chapter by Susan. Obviously, this is a concept developed by Carol Pateman, and taken up by Carol Machete as well in the work that Susan draws on to discuss this. And Susan links the exercise of the male sex right to men's interests and claims as staked through what we describe as war under patriarchy. But of course, of which that's a male definition, and we might say that we're always under conditions of war from the perspective of women, but for men, it's about, their patriotic actions against each other that then inflict upon women's intimate lives in terms of sexual violence. So to quote just a little bit further, war is institutional and based on the legitimate power of the state or community. Violence against women is also institutional, but is made out to be personal. It is not clear which precedes the other, except that the violence of one man must have preceded the violence of many. The woman is tortured, raped, beaten as a warning to other women. Enemy women are raped to punish and pollute enemy men. Men own war, they are proud of it. It proves their masculinity like nothing else, except sometimes raping a woman, especially when raping her in the presence of other men. For a man to step back and to refuse is not read as a challenge to men's humanity, but rather as a challenge to his masculinity, which I thought that was a really nice summation of what war is under patriarchy, because it goes exactly against what liberal men keep telling women is the meaning of war, which is, a descendants of, our humanity as, collective human race and all that kind of thing. But in Susan's different formulation, it's actually an exercise of masculinity that men can't refuse. I really enjoyed this chapter, Susan, and it contains one of your tables also, which is really interesting. The table is split up between militarism, capitalism, fundamentalism, and the sex industry into 4 columns, and then these similar elements of these 4 pillars of patriarchy are discussed in this chapter in the table. But I wonder, just as a question in relation to that, why do you think it's important for feminists to emphasize these 4 interlinking institutions of patriarchy? What crucial importance does it have?
I think what's important is that all of these systems, which are militarism, capitalism, fundamentalism, and the sex industry, they operate not just in parallel ways, but they all operate to support one another. And in my chart that goes with this chapter, I have under militarism, new recruit, move him away from family and community. So you see that with every soldier who joins up. Capitalism, I was thinking here of the young men who become the financiers, and take in an overly protected young man who has a sense of entitlement or is traumatized and wants to make up for the trauma. Under fundamentalism, take in an already traumatized young man, possibly orphaned, displaced, abused, refugee. And in the sex industry, take in already traumatized young women and men, displaced, drug addicted, abused victims of war or violence. So in another column, number 4, instill, this is militarism, instill high level of patriotism, revere president, obey all military with higher ranks. Under capitalism, instill high level of market fervor, revere venture capitalists. Under fundamentalism, instill high level of religious fervor, revere priests, rabbis, mullahs. And in the sex industry, instill high level of fervor for the rewards offered, revere money and material goods. And I go through different aspects and take that through. And it actually surprised me how how connected they all were, all these different systems. Okay, I think I'm on to chapter 4 after this.
Great.
Yep. So this chapter is called Biocolonialism and Bioprospecting, Wars Against Indigenous Peoples and Women. So it focuses on the ways in which corporates, governments and capitalists are profiteering on the bodies of women, of colonized land, of disabled bodies, of lesbian and gay bodies. So colonization is the model for corporate profit. Just as land has been stolen and then depleted of its natural resources, the cell lines of Indigenous people have been micro-colonized, patented, and then used to save more important people in other places. Land and bodies are declared as empty, barbarous, inferior, or unnatural, and therefore considered acceptable to profiteer from. So here are 5 examples of these things. Mining of land, acting rapaciously and turning it into monocultures. 2, colonized peoples are treated as a resource, dispossessed, enslaved, prostituted, their bodies harvested, and their cultural and art practices appropriated and sold. Women's bodies are treated as a resource, trafficked, sold into prostitution, surrogacy. Women's cultural achievements are demeaned and erased and turned into insulting products. People with disabilities become considered as falling short of perfection. Lesbians and gays are the latest move, and we are exoticized and eroticized and transitioned out of existence. So the elimination of these entities is aimed for separating Indigenous people from land, eliminating their languages and cultures, murdering and domestication of women, elimination of disabled people through screening, endless testing and domestication. For lesbians and gays, domestication and conversion therapies such as trans, and Carolyn will pick up on that later. In chapter 5, which is the one called Deterritoriality and Breaking the Spirit, Land, Refugees and Trauma, I realized later that this was where I started to repeat the word breaking the spirit in the chapter titles. It grew out of my discussion in chapter 4 of deterritoriality. So deterritoriality is the process of dispossessing people. It can be done through the usual practices of colonizers, such as by dropping nuclear bombs, so land is unusable for hundreds, if not thousands of years. A comparable process is carried out against all the enslaved and women. They all involve the infliction of pain, loss of dignity, and excessive punishment. Dominance is the key strategy, and that includes standard torture practices, such as turning whatever the person knows against her himself. This leads to breaking the spirit and wearing down through gradual and repeated dehumanization. And in the end, the person begins to feel homeless in the body. Jo, can you share the slide that I have here, please, for chapter 5? So on this, I haven't included the whole chart, but there's enough of it here to see. So I've got very small, sorry, this was hard to make these bits bigger and I couldn't. I've got 3 columns: torture, trauma, and colonization. So under torture, there's complete subordination and humiliation of the tortured person. And under trauma, the result of subordination, it's the result of subordination and humiliation, and under-colonization of an entire people, and as members of the colonizing group. And you can see as I go down, so the torture person gets worn down by repeated violations. The torturer becomes sovereign, gets complete control over every intimate feeling and emotion, and the tortured person feels homeless in her own body. The column under trauma, so it is the result of persistent and continuous expressions of hatred or diminishment of person. This happens to many women. It happens to people in all sorts of subordinated groups. The individual needs are determined by those with power. So there is a loss of cultural and bodily sovereignty. And there's a sense of not belonging. Isolation pervades the psyche of the traumatized person. Under colonization, you get very similar patterns. The colonized people are worn down by repeated violations against them and minimization of their own worth. And the colonizer imposes their sovereignty and has complete control over small acts carried out by the colonized. Something as small as ways of greeting or methods of relationship designations. And this is particularly so if there are different languages and different cultural formations. And the colonized person often feels homeless in his or her own land. So that's, you can take that down now, or maybe leave it for a little longer. So in coming to write this, I referred to two autobiographical accounts on this sense of homelessness. One is the experience of prostituted women. The phrase homeless in the body comes from Rhonda Copeland's 1994 essay in Alexandra Stiglmaier's book, Mass Rape, and the experiences of women in war. And in this instance, it was the wars in the former Yugoslavia. Rachel Moran, in her book, Paid For: My Journey Through Prostitution, writes of the permanent stigma of being an exile. Jean Amery, in his book on torture, At the Mind's Limits, says that a person who's been tortured can no longer feel at home in the world, while Kurdish journalist and refugee advocate Behruz Buchani, who will be well known to Australians and New Zealanders, writes of how the conditions on Manus Island created hatred between the prisoners and made them isolated and insular. So this sense of homelessness can be from one's own body, the alienation that results from trauma, especially persistent and repeated trauma, as well as feeling homeless in one's own land. For refugees, prostituted women and Indigenous peoples, all of these can apply simultaneously. The next chapter, Chapter 6, is on colonization, erasure and torture, wars against lesbians. I specifically wanted to have a chapter that focused solely on lesbians because, like people with disabilities, lesbians tend to be left out of just about all political analyses. In spite of our very real contributions to political change and to challenging power and dominance in patriarchy. So this chapter began when I was in Uganda in 2002, when a woman, in response to a question I asked about lesbians, came up to me after a session and said to me, "Be very careful, because in Uganda, lesbians are tortured, raped and violated, and the campaigns to end such attacks are rare. Although it is possible you may have seen petitions to stop the torture of gay men in Uganda. They're much more likely to see those than ones about lesbians." the statistics and narrative over and ignore lesbians or make it reduced in some way. On the Western Cape of South Africa, so many lesbians were subjected to corrective rape that on just one occasion it made the news in Australia, which is really, really rare. So I'm just going to read out some of the names of the women who were subjected to corrective rape in South Africa. So Zolizwa Nkonyana in Cape Town, 2006, Sizakeli Sigasa and Salome Masusa in Soweto, 2007, Simangele Nglapo in 2007, Yudi Simelane, 2009, Ludzila Zozo, 2013. The irony, of course, is that South Africa is the only country in the world that protects well, lesbians and gays in the Constitution, and yet this happens. The most important essay that I read on the subject was by Consuelo Rivera Fuentes and her partner Linda Burke in 2001. It was published. Consuelo was arrested during the Pinochet regime in the 1970s, and she writes of the terrible pain of time. Where is my I? This is a critical question for lesbians. Where is my I? Because lesbians are considered a nonsense. Lesbians are a long way outside the political campaign for those treated abysmally by governments, corporates, do-gooders, and individual men and women. The I, the me, for lesbians can be difficult to find. When a lesbian applies for a refugee status, it can take a very long time. For Nigerian lesbian activist Aderonke Apata, it took 13 years to gain asylum in the UK because she had a child. The authorities said she must be heterosexual. And in the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, lesbians are subjected to really high levels of abuse and persecution. And although I wrote about this in 2020, the situation is just as bad now as it was then, even though there have been a number of campaigns. On top of all this is the complication of shame. Vera Kurtic wrote about Roma lesbians and the way in which Roma lesbians are completely dislocated from the Romani community. In 2023, we see this occurring in the so-called pride marches, where lesbians are excluded, sometimes beaten up by trans activists, that is, men who want to call themselves women. The colonization process is alive and well when it comes to lesbians. Lesbians are insulted, threatened, and our political achievements are sidelined. But as Sheila Jeffreys said in 1993, that lesbian feminists were visionary in their demands for a better world. That was in The Lesbian Heresy. Lesbians are the canaries in the mine. When lesbians are attacked and the attackers get away with it, there will be further attacks on other groups in the future, because hatred towards lesbians is normalized. Only lesbians notice. Consider the trial of Dana Rivers, a man who calls himself a woman. He killed 2 lesbians and their son, and after being convicted was transferred to a women's prison in California. And if you haven't seen the petition about that, look for it and sign it. We need to get him out of that prison. The shame and disgrace that is loaded on the shoulders of lesbians makes it harder for individual lesbians and even groups of lesbians. You can see this in the push to create trans men out of young lesbians, coming up, more on this from Caroline. Corrective rape, the belief that raping a lesbian can convert her to heterosexual beyond belief. It's based on the almost universal patriarchal belief that women's bodies belong to men. The so-called human rights of lesbians are trashed in what Indian writer Maya Sharma calls a discourse of catastrophe, and New Zealander Alison Hopkins refers to as symbolic annihilation. Extreme violence against lesbians happens under every single kind of political regime. I finished the chapter with a list of guidelines for officials interviewing lesbian refugees, in which the usual assumptions about lesbians are challenged. So here are 3 examples from that list. There's many more. Do not assume that a married woman cannot be a lesbian. In some countries, marriage is the first level of protection that a lesbian might seek. Do not assume that your interpreter is open to her experience. The interpreter might be hostile to her claim. Lesbians who are refugees might also be in danger from their families, in particular the men in their families. Her confidential interview should not be shared by asking questions about her sexual orientation of other, not sharing that with members of her family. So, Caroline, over to you.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, that's really powerful. And yeah, I mean, all of us know that even from within our own tent, we've seen Catherine McKinnon's recent essay directly named lesbian feminists as responsible for the transgendering of young girls. And also, Sheila Jeffries has faced trouble over, issues of lesbianism as a choice for any woman, and just saying that alone apparently is not permitted within even radical feminist circles. So I think this abuse of lesbians and hate, sort of the tendency to scapegoat lesbians goes deep even within our own movement, which is very scary. But yeah, my next chapter is chapter 7, Breaking the Spirit of the Women's Liberation Movement, the War Against Biology, which is completely related to Susan's discussion just now, and particularly discusses the situation of adolescent girls, also boys. But yeah, in this chapter, Susan focuses particularly on what the genderist ideology and movement is doing to young people. At the beginning, she says, learning to survive when you are a young person who does not fit into the expected roles of your sex, your race, your ethnicity, your class, your place in the family and the world is hard. These are difficult experiences for adolescents. There are services provided to help cope with most of these adolescent hurdles. But recently, the service has become the hurdle. For young women and men who feel challenged by gender expectations, the service has turned on them by offering the diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So this chapter goes through the various ways in which genderist ideology and its practices and its harms through medicine, how they separate the individual from themselves in terms of their well-being and flourishing, particularly as young people. And so there's the various ways in which the ideology does that is the focus of chapter 7, which made it particularly interesting. Susan writes that external trauma, such as child abuse, anorexia, and autism, are turned into an internally generated cause. Like so many women in the past, punished not for what they do, but for who they are, these young women are offered a way out. They are offered puberty blockers, then cross-sex hormones, and later irreversible double mastectomy surgery. Young men are offered similar irreversible options. Both are told that this will free them from trauma and that they can go and live normal lives. In fact, these are normalized lives made to fit gender stereotypes. I think this goes back to Susan's theme throughout the book about this sort of eugenicist kind of push for perfection that actually just fits people into things like gender stereotypes, and then sells back to them the idea that they've reached perfection as a result of achieving that, particularly for young people, is a horrifying outcome, as we're seeing now. And then just the last part of that chapter, which I found really interesting, is again going back to this theme of women being scapegoated for the harms that men and men's systems do. And Susan writes, quote, "Women who refuse to kowtow to the trans agenda, those who use the word woman, those who dead name, in other words, use the pre-transition name of men who purport to be women, those who always use the wrong pronoun, all of these things hurt the male ego so much that they lash out and punish women. It is almost always women who are punished," is the sort of the ending conclusion to chapter 7, which I thought was just a fantastic chapter. Over to you, Susan.
Okay, so chapter 8 is Breaking the Spirit of the Planet, Climate Catastrophe. And while human experience makes up most of the book, there are clear intersections between humans and the natural world. And since patriarchal capitalism is at the forefront of this exploitation of people and resources, and at the root of changes to our climate, I wanted to apply the same kind of analysis to this area. I've lived through a number of catastrophes, drought, cyclones, floods, and bushfire, as have many other people in Australia, and now more regularly affecting those in the Northern Hemisphere, as we've seen on our TVs in the last week. As I was writing this chapter in early 2020, bushfires were decimating the southern states of Australia, and each day the area of land burnt was growing. By early March, it started in late December, early March 2020, 18.6 million hectares had been burnt. It's actually really hard to know what that is. So 10 million hectares is the equivalent size of Iceland. So it was almost double that size. It's huge. Droughts were a constant in my childhood, growing up on a farm in a very dry zone, and water a perennial problem. In my 20s, in 1974, the area my parents had moved to and now lived in was devastated by flooding. I now live in the tropics and have been through 2 Category 5 cyclones. That's stronger than Katrina, Hurricane Katrina. And I hear regularly about coral bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef, which is just outside my window in a way. Every part of the world now has crises of these kinds. But as I've noted before, every technological failure is a new business opportunity for venture capitalists and technocrats who thrive on patriarchal systems and wars. The money trail, which I include throughout the book, is filled with billionaires, coal miners, pesticide companies, as well as the big pharma companies who populate the funders of the trans industry. Peter Buffett, Berkshire Hathaway, the Gates Foundation, Bayer, Monsanto, the data miners who are tracking everything we do. The same names come up again and again. Soros in selling sex, the Buffetts in cotton farming, and now we have them competing for domination of outer space and endless AI repeats on TV and devices in which writers and actors are ripped off in perpetuity. I mean that literally, universally and perpetuity. No copyright on AI. There are ways to battle these behemoths, but it takes time. It takes knowledge of the past, it takes understanding how biodiversity works, and it will take radical feminists, lesbians, Indigenous peoples, peoples of colour, and anyone pushed out of the mainstream because we are not perfect. This all sounds very depressing, but my book does end on a hopeful note with brief discussions of the concept of the uncultivated, a concept I learnt about from Farida Akhtar in Bangladesh, about sovereignty, its importance, but also the dangers of libertarian calls for individualized sovereignty, such as self-ID. And I then write about my wishes for a good radical feminist future, enlivened by meaningful relationship, freedom from violence and colonization. And I want and hope for a friendlier world, not based on profit and greed that comes with creativity, because what is life without creativity? So that's the end of my notes.
Thanks, Susan. That's a lovely, hopeful note to end on, I think. But I think it's been a theme of yours throughout your writing career, though, with Wild Politics. I think that was a very strong theme, that we needed to move away from the patriarchal, straitjacketed kind of lack of diversity, lack of openness and engagement, and get away from that and have our own ethic as feminists, but are you able to say much about how you've moved from wild? I know you said a little bit already, but anything further about how you've moved from wild politics to Vortex?
Well, one of the things that has surprised me in a way is that diversity was really at the center of that book. And I was talking a lot about biodiversity, but I was also talking about people diversity. And of course, diversity now is the buzzword for the trans activists who claim that this is the most important thing that has ever happened. And you know, in the publishing industry, of which I'm a part, diversity is a phase that the publishing industry is going through. But Spinifex and Renata and I both were doing diversity long before, you know, decades, literally decades before it became a buzzword. And before we were both doing it individually before we started Spinifex too. So, you know, that's what happens. The patriarchy, the capitalists, etc., they come along, they appropriate things, they then distort them so that they're slightly different from how they used to be. They start to monetize them, then they sell them back, especially to the next generation who's not aware of what's gone on in the past, and they make a profit from it. So that's part of what I'm saying when you know, every technological failure is a new business opportunity. And, you know, that's all part of that same thing. And diversity has been appropriated. And I did say that could probably happen in wild politics, but I said I was more hopeful about biodiversity because it's a bit harder to appropriate it. But I'm sure they'll think of a way.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that the COVID pandemic has kind of punctuated the time between the wild politics and Vortex. I mean, I know you wrote Vortex during the pandemic itself, but I think we seem to have faced that narrative since the pandemic that, you know, the extent to which societies have been held together through the low-level efforts of women that, you know, had state functions pushed upon them, and therefore, you know, the state structures weren't at all, you know, equipped to handle something like a pandemic. But by virtue of women being so, you know, diligent and caring for themselves and caring for the earth and the children and everything else, that, you know, countries managed to get through it one way or another. But I was just wondering, like, do you envisage, you know, a further volume that builds upon wild politics and Vortex and goes further in relation to what we've seen in the pandemic or anything like that?
I am going to put out a book next week called next year, called now what is it called? It's called Lesbian Essays on Politics and Existence. And so I'm bringing together all the things that I've written since 1976 that have the word lesbian in the title. I discovered by accident that I have written something like 60 articles with the word lesbian in the title. I had no idea that I had done that. I thought, well, I probably should make something of this. And so I had to cut it back, you know, and choose. I've got, I think, probably 20 essays, and it covers lesbian politics. It covers also human rights. It covers the trans debate, and it also covers a whole lot of things about lesbian culture, poetry and art, and the culture that lesbians have built up in the last 50 odd years during the women's liberation movement and through till now. Because I think that it's really important to acknowledge that women have a culture and lesbians have a culture, and neither of those is recognised. And what you see on TV and in the movies is much more like what you see when you go to watch Barbie or something similar. There are a few exceptions. There are some great movies out there and some really good TV shows. But, you know, they're rare and they're not part of the mainstream.
Yeah, isn't it interesting that we get to this historical period in politics whereby we have the feminists who don't see women as a class, the feminists that, you know, argue for diversity of genders. They've taken just the labelling and the outer casing of this diversity concept that was articulated by you most of all, Susan, in Wild Politics, but by other feminists as well, radical feminists, taking the outer casing and brought it forward. And lo and behold, the thing that they apply it to is to gender. So they want diversity of genders, whereas the Radical Feminist Project was to abolish gender, the sex class hierarchy, the sex class system. It seems extraordinary that if they're so interested in diversity and alternative futures for people as social beings, in that case, why didn't they turn to the work that you and other radical feminists have done, Sheila Jeffries has done on lesbian feminism? I mean, of all the diverse and interesting and, you know, innovative kind of social experiments, you know, lived out by actual women you can speak to, none of the genderists turned their attention to that. And now what we have is lesbian feminists being blamed that they didn't give young women enough of an option to break out of, you know, in their words, gender binary. I don't like that phrase, but that's what they say, break out of that gender binary. And now to blame lesbian feminists for that, when it was precisely the whole, you know, a good part of lesbian feminism and separatism was about this diversity kind of push. I don't know whether you...
And then they drape men's bodies in stereotypical dresses and think that that's exciting and different. Yeah, it's truly mind-blowing.
And I think the direction that Sheila Jeffries' work is perhaps taking, and she'll know better, of course, but the diversity of the sexual fetishes among men put out into the public now. I mean, we're talking about, they really are into this. I mean, corporate, obviously, you know, corporate, you know, strategic statements have it in their first line, diversity and inclusion. Inclusion is maybe a separate discussion, but this diversity concept that they've taken up with a vengeance is really, now being used to damage radical feminism very badly. But I'm not wanting to end on and we've got a couple more minutes, not wanting to end on a negative note, but Susan, I'll throw to you to conclude.
Well, I think it's interesting that the least diverse group in the world gets the word diversity and gets to use it and claim it and say what it thinks, which really is quite extraordinary. And, you know, when it comes to things like, you know, drag time for children, and what they're presenting is the worst stereotypes that we as feminists, even ordinary non-radical feminists, have been protesting for at least 50 years, 60 years, I think, and that somehow this isn't noticed by so many people, not just men, but also a lot of women who should know. But what is noticeable is that there are a lot of women in their 50s, 60s, 70s who are very clear. And I've discovered a number of women who I did not expect to be on the same side as me come out and say, absolutely agree with you. And some of it is generational. It's not all generational, because there is a really substantial group of younger women who are saying the same things. But I think they're a little less visible at this stage. I think it's generally older women who are clearer about it. Just as when we were young, the older women were the communists who had been through a lot of fights in their younger years. They knew how to strategize, they knew how to organize, and we learned a lot from the women who'd been in the Communist Party, and I'm always very grateful to them, actually.
Exactly, and I think that's a happy note to end on, and mention Victoria Smith-Hagg as well, which that's the thesis of her excellent, in my opinion, her excellent book, to name one other book in addition to Susan Hawthorne's Vortex. So we'll say good night and goodbye, good morning to everyone for now, for this week's seminar, and look forward to seeing you in 3 weeks' time, I think it is. Thanks, Jo.
Thank you, Carolyn, for being part of this with me. It's been really delightful.
For me too.